Good morning. Yeah. Welcome back to this morning's first session, which is on identity and the law. We have a stellar lineup of speakers this morning, and I'm going to be extremely brief in introducing them because more about them is in your program packet. We're going to hear first from Professor Amy Wax of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, who is, in addition to being a lawyer and a law professor, also a medical doctor and a seasoned veteran of the Solicitor General's office, where she argued many cases before the Supreme Court. We'll hear after Professor Wax from Professor Richard Parker from here at Harvard, an old comrade in arms of mine, a professor of con law, and an author recently on a very interesting piece in the Harvard Journal on Law and Public Policy concerning patriotism, to which I commend to you. I think that was 2002. We'll hear, after Professor Parker, we'll hear from Commissioner Jennifer Braceras of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, also returning, also a journey home for her to be here today. And then from Professor James Lindgren, Northwestern University, someone who is adept with statistics and quantitative data. I think maybe we'll treat us to a little bit of that today, I hope so. And then from Professor Douglas Kamick of Pepperdine University, formerly Dean at Catholic University Law School, and formerly Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel. Because of the nature of our topic, I'm going to begin with a very brief story that implicates all of the criteria that we'll be discussing. It's about the election of the first Jewish female president of the United States, who proudly, when she's elected, calls her parents to invite them to the inauguration. And her mother says, well, you know, we don't like to travel anymore. It's just too difficult. And she says, that's okay, Mom, we're sending a plane for you, Air Force plane, we'll be there to get you. And her mother says, well, you know, you all eat such rich foods, we really don't think we ought to be engaging in this kind of partying. And the president-elect says, Mom, the whole inauguration, it's the first time, is going to be kosher, don't worry about it at all. So she's prevailed upon, and they come down for the inauguration, and during the swearing-in ceremony on the steps of the Capitol, just as she has her hand raised and her one hand on the Bible, her mother taps the Senate Majority Leader on the shoulder, the man sitting in front of her, and she says, you see the girl with her hand on the Bible? Yes. She says, her brother's a doctor. Okay, that said, I give you Hair Doctor Professor Amy Wax.
Judge Ginsburg, that just struck a little too close to home. As my teenage daughter would say, don't go there. I am going to talk about a category, an identity category that I guess appropriately for the opening parlay cuts across other categories: gender, race, ethnicity. And I'm going to try to stick to my time. As a veteran of Supreme Court arguments, I'm used to getting the hook, but I don't like it. Don't like it any better now than I did then. But I'll do my best. And these remarks are a distillation of a longer piece that I'm working on that looks at the conceptual and psychological aspects of what I term victimology and society's attitudes towards victims. And my focus, although it really, I'm just focusing today for purposes of brevity, is on the disadvantage suffered by African Americans, but really my remarks are pertinent to all forms of group disadvantage. Now, Bill Cosby's repeated suggestion that the behavior of some American blacks impede group progress has transgressed the long-standing taboo against blaming the victim, and we know what happened to him. Blaming the victim was defined by the sociologist William Ryan in a 1971 book that was quite famous at the time, and he defined it as an attempt to explain inequality by finding defects in the victims of inequality. So I think at this juncture, victim blaming is virtually banned from polite discourse, but my view is that the time has come for that to change, because the disdain for anything that smacks of blaming the victim is based on a fundamental confusion, a conceptual confusion, which I think leads into a kind of psychological rut that impedes group progress. Now, no one can deny that black Americans have endured a history of sustained and grievous mistreatment, and that these wrongs have wreaked immeasurable harm. And actually, when I've given this talk elsewhere, some people have denied that, but I think for the purposes of our discussion, I am going to assume this, and I think the assumption is fair. But to me, the key question confronting society is not how those harms occurred, but rather how to reverse them. And in looking at these two aspects, the law of remedies is highly instructive, and I teach remedies, so I'm going to take a lesson from that body of doctrine and law. A central tenet of the law of remedies is that someone who harms another person, the wrongdoer, the malefactor, must undo the harm. That is perhaps the central idea of remedies. So justice requires that the culprit right the wrong by restoring the victim to the so-called rightful position, the state he would have enjoyed had the harm never occurred. Right? Now, in distinguishing between liability and remedy, right, between the harm and undoing the harm, the law of remedies recognizes that the reality can fall short of the ideal. Indeed, it frequently does. Right? The wrongdoer may quite literally lack the power to put the victim back in the rightful position, to make the victim whole. So the assailant cannot restore the eye that he has destroyed. The murderer cannot bring the dead child back to life, and full justice for the victim may simply be out of reach. Now, the case I'm concerned with is a special case of that broader principle, the case in which the victim's injuries can be healed, but not, unfortunately, by the culpable party. Rather, in a cruel twist of fate, the victim is the only one who can undo the harm he has suffered at others' hands. The victim must restore himself to the rightful position. Now, as an example of that, a sort of less incendiary example perhaps, consider what I call the parable of the paraplegic. A reckless driver runs over a pedestrian, leaves him unable to walk. The driver pays for the pedestrian's treatment and physical therapy, but recovery, he is told, will require a long, painful, and arduous effort. The victim is angry, he's outraged, it's not his fault. Why does he have to face this overwhelming struggle? Alas, said the therapist, there is no way out, there is no help for it. Although the driver will bankroll, he cannot guarantee success. He cannot make the victim walk again. And the parable, I think, illuminates the present dilemma of black disadvantage. Right? There's no question that the problems blacks face today are an outgrowth of past oppression, but unfortunately that oppression has distorted behavior and values. Bad habits take on a life of their own, impeding the ability to grasp opportunities. The victim has changed in ways that place him beyond the reach of outside help alone. And indeed, there is strong evidence that enduring harms to human capital, as the economists and sociologists call it, which are a legacy of racism, loom far larger today than overt barriers, overt exclusion. Right? So we are talking here about poor educational attainment, poor socialization, family disarray, paternal abandonment, out-of-wedlock childbearing, and the norms that grow up around those behaviors, that entrench those behaviors within communities. But society's power to address those problems is, by its very nature, severely limited, right? And this is where freedom comes in. Short of outright coercion, it is literally impossible for the government or outsiders to change dysfunctional behavior, make good choices for individuals. No one can force someone to obey the law, study hard, develop useful skills, be well-mannered, speak and write well, marry, stay married, take responsibility for their children, and the like, right? Why are these propositions surprising? These decisions belong to individuals and communities, but the quest for justice blinds us to this. We want to believe that those who cause the wrongs can undo the wrongs, that indeed just by reversing course, eliminating discrimination, because discrimination caused the problem, we can solve the problem. That is the myth of reverse causation. The law recognizes that reverse causation doesn't always work, right? The one who caused the problem can't necessarily solve it. That something is fair doesn't mean it's possible. Outsiders can help, but there are some things people can only do for themselves. So what are the implications of this for racial equality? A few points. First, it should be obvious that accepting a key role for victims doesn't really blame the victim, because it implies no exoneration of the wrongdoer, right? Slavery and discrimination brought us here. That means that the government must do what it can to abate those harms, but given the nature of the problem, government's role is necessarily modest. The key reforms must come from within. Second, true racial justice may not be achievable. Is it fair to charge blacks with the weighty task of self-improvement when others' wrongs have made their burden so great? That answer must be no, but that doesn't change the reality. Just as the careless driver can pay for therapy, doesn't mean he can make the paraplegic walk again. The government must supply resources and opportunities, but cannot return disadvantaged groups to their rightful position, right? Try as we might, only the victim can heal himself. Third, somewhat counterintuitively, and I've come to this conclusion by looking at this problem over a long period, I do believe that rehearsing the history of racial oppression, although important for moral clarity, is of little use in addressing current inequalities. In seeking solutions, we must look forward rather than dwelling on the past, because the way out of the present dilemma may not in any respect resemble the way in. It's necessary, I think, to keep an open mind, to stick close to the data, to engage in trial and error. And above all, the road to equality begins at home. Finally, the persistence of racial disadvantage does not mean that society and the government has failed to do enough. The greatest need at present may not be more government spending and new programs, but a conversion experience. The victim must see that although others have wronged him, his fate lies in his own hands. Justice may be elusive, but success is the best revenge. Above all, the victim must see that he is a free moral agent, free to overcome those internal demons, although others have raised those demons. And that requires seeing something which in our society I think we are averse to seeing, that internal obstacles are fundamentally different from external barriers, external coercion, right, such as old-fashioned discrimination. The modern impulse is to collapse these. Now, to be sure, external conditions can make things harder or easier, and frankly, I think this is one of the lessons of the Summers flap, that we do have to think about the ways in which we can change things around as we are free to do so to accommodate real differences in human nature. I think in his case the differences between men and women and whether we want to do that. But that doesn't change the fact that the victim, the individual, is free to make good or bad choices. Now, how can we do that? How can we inspire the victim to do that? Once again, if I knew the answer, I would patent it, make a lot of money. I think that is for those within disadvantaged communities to try and figure out. But the first step in doing that is realizing, in my mind, that that is where the action is, and I think that that step has not yet been taken. Thank you.
Before we hear from Professor Parker, I just want to take a moment to point out to everybody as the room fills up that there is another room, and perhaps yet another after that. This conference has about 850 people registered, undoubtedly a new record for the Student Symposium, and a great tribute to the organizers. Professor Wax's remarks remind me of something that Dean Kamick said last evening during the panel discussion, reflecting some of his time in Washington, I guess. He said, seems no one on this panel is worried about confirmability. The tradition continues this morning. We'll hear from Professor Parker.
Thank you very much. I realized last night during the very interesting panel that I'd better start by clarifying where I'm coming from, since it may be a little bit different from some others. The freedom I want to talk about this morning is the one I think is most fundamental, and that is political freedom, by which I mean the summoning and exertion of one's energy to engage and to conflict with others about collective values and interests. And what I have in mind more specifically is democratic political freedom, by which I mean a freedom within the context of a politics shaped by three connected norms: political equality, popular sovereignty, and therefore majority rule. Thus, democratic political freedom, as I'm using the term, involves the exertion of political energy so as to become part of a majority. Now, I want to make 5 points or claims related to the topic of this panel. First, my first claim is that all democratic politics is, and appropriately is, identity politics. By that I mean that political activity is, in fact, structured and animated by efforts to define and to defend who I am, or we are, or hope to be, or hope to be seen to be. This is a process, the process of identity politics, through which we may well redefine all those things over and over again. That's what democratic politics, I believe, is, and it's what democratic politics should be, because what identity politics, so understood, involves is self-government through self-creation, and thus the exercise of political freedom. That's my first point. Now, my second claim, however, is that identity politics can and sometimes may tend to dampen, to smother, and even to erase democratic political freedom. What interests me, therefore, is what turns the one into the other. What sorts of identity politics, what aspects of identity politics, and especially what kinds of identification and self-identification are pathological to democratic freedom, and under what conditions are they pathological? Now, my third claim is that three currently prominent diagnoses of the pathological tendency, about which we've already heard something and we'll hear more this morning, of identity politics, are mistaken, at least partly. Three common diagnoses that I believe are at least partly mistaken. The three diagnoses are as follows. The first one is the suggestion that identity politics fosters stereotyping, which is supposed to be bad, as opposed to individuality, which is supposed to be good. The second diagnosis is that identity politics inherently emphasizes differences or boundaries between people, which is bad, supposedly, rather than bonds or connections among us, which supposedly is inherently good. The third common diagnosis that I believe is mistaken is that identity politics feeds on and promotes a sense of victimhood and blaming of others, which is supposedly bad, rather than self-responsibility, which is supposedly good. Now, about all three of those diagnoses, I have three things to say that I'll have to, for now, just state abstractly and perhaps can talk a little more concretely about later. My three critiques of those three diagnoses are as follows. First, each one of the criticized aspects of identity politics, stereotyping, difference, and victimhood, is, I believe, essential to any identity politics. Thus, without them, we would lose its good self-creating, freedom-promoting power. That's my first critique. Secondly, each of the aspects that are criticized, stereotyping, difference, and victimhood, I believe is not just essential to any identity politics, but is also politically energizing and thus good in itself for democratic political freedom. My third critique is that each of the qualities that are commonly portrayed as opposed to the supposedly pathological qualities, that is to say, individuality, commonality, and self-responsibility, could tend, if fully divorced from the supposedly pathological aspects of identity politics, could tend themselves to dampen, if not smother, democratic political freedom. Now, I know that's very abstract, but I don't think I have time to be more concrete right now. Moving on to my fourth claim. My fourth claim is that what we ought to focus our concern upon, our concern about identity politics, are three other more contingent or situational aspects of identity politics. Now let me list these. First, we should be concerned about situations in which the identification of a group identity is dominated by so-called spokesmen for or elite advocates for the group, passively acquiesced in by members of the group. Those spokesmen or advocates might, for example, be lawyers. That, I believe, is pathological. Secondly, we should be concerned about situations in which social or moral or political pressure to adopt and conform to some supposed identity, or to refrain from the outside, as it were, from criticizing it, is brought to bear. When there's pressure brought to bear, either from within or without, to enforce conformity to, or at least polite, if hypocritical, respect for some asserted identity. That's pathological, number two. Number three, we should be concerned about situations in which the assertion of an identity is bound up with prejudice against others, against outsiders to that identity, prejudice against them as somehow inferior. Now, these, I think, are three contingent aspects of identity politics that tend to poison rather than to promote democratic political freedom, and that have, over the last 30 years or so, far too much characterized the politically correct multiculturalism with which I think everyone here is very familiar. Now on to my fifth and final claim. This is the cash value of my pitch here today, and probably the most controversial thing I'll have to say. There is, I think, one general overriding kind of self-identification that has most fundamentally poisoned democratic politics and thus harmed democratic political freedom during this last 3 decades or so. And this is the idea of a variety, but a limited variety, of individuals and groups identified as, or self-identified as, quote, minorities, unquote. Now, what's wrong with this identification or self-identification as a minority? This time I have 4 things to say. First, this term, minority, has become a bureaucratic category over the last 3 decades. Some groups are official minorities, blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. Others are not, white ethnics, for example. The supposed traits, interests, and values of the official minorities are officially defined not just by official spokesmen, but by real officials, bureaucrats, and that I've defined as pathological. Secondly, definition as, quote, a minority has in fact been the predicate for significant pressure to conform or to refrain from criticizing what are supposedly the interests or traits or values of that minority, and also for the exertion of official power to those ends. Third, identity as and advocacy of, quote, minorities, unquote, I think has tended to involve prejudice against another group, quote, the majority, exemplified by some image of white males, I guess. This is not just corrosive, but it's, of course, absurd, since advocates of, quote, minorities tend to celebrate not just minorities, but what they call women and minorities, which is naturally a majority. Fourth point, most fundamentally, I believe identification or self-identification as a minority or minorities is antithetical to and antagonistic to a basic norm of democratic politics, which is majority rule. The terms minorities have tended to become reified and imagined as permanent, and the talk about minorities' disadvantage has tended to become part and parcel of a redefinition of democracy itself over the last 30 years in such a way as to erase a recognition of democratic politics and the conflict essential to democracy. Majority rule is denigrated, voting is denigrated. Democracy is imagined as service of a common weal or justice or a deliberative consensus based in public reason, you name it. All of these definitions suppress a recognition and high valuation of conflict. Now, and here's my last point, and here I'm trying to goad some of you. I know that talk about majority factions and minority factions and the protection of the latter against the former goes back to the man whose silhouette is behind this screen. Well, in this area, it's time to give Madison up. Okay? I think his influence is pernicious in this respect. And I want to suggest a different silhouette, not very seriously, but I'll suggest it anyhow. The silhouette that I would suggest you put up there is that of Lenin. For two reasons. First, as a warning or a spur to vigilance, since Lenin, after all, was the most notorious one in the last century, to smother and erase real democratic political conflict in the name of supposedly true democracy and a pathological identity politics, the creation of a, quote, new man. That's what Lenin was out to do. We should watch for Leninism in the dominant democratic political theory of our day, and having his silhouette before us would remind us to do that. But then secondly, there's a second and last reason why Lenin's silhouette would be valuable here, and that is not as a warning, but as an example. Lenin knew something that we have forgotten, and that is that in the exercise of political freedom, it doesn't make sense. It's not good for you to label yourself at the outset as a minority, but rather to keep in mind that the point is to become part of the majority. That's why Lenin named his faction the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were a minority, but the word Bolshevik means majority, and that's a good reminder.
Good morning. When I was a student at Harvard about 15 years ago, the Federalist Society had the Student Symposium here. So it's nice to be back, although this time as a panelist instead of an attendee. I'd like to focus my remarks on the interplay between one's identity as an American and one's identity as part of a subgroup of Americans based on race or ethnicity. Our identity as Americans is based on shared values of individual freedom and political democracy, ideals which transcend racial and ethnic differences. But while these values transcend race and ethnicity, they do not eliminate our cultural differences, nor should they. Some commentators on both the political right and the political left have suggested that these two forms of identity, Americanism on the one hand and racial or ethnic identity on the other hand, are contradictory or incompatible. That in order to celebrate one form of our identity, we must necessarily suppress the other. Thus, there are some on the political right who wish to ignore or even eliminate most of our racial and ethnic differences. These folks believe, incorrectly I think, that the elimination of cultural differences and ethnic pride is necessary to effective assimilation. I think these critics misread the desire to preserve cultural traditions and the desire for role models or the urge to honor a group's distinctive past as a rejection of our shared American culture. It doesn't have to be. These critics find it difficult to understand why, for example, Latinos might want to teach their children Spanish at home as well as having them learn English at school, or why they might feel pride in Alberto Gonzalez's nomination to be the first Hispanic Attorney General of the United States. And they find it difficult to understand why African Americans might lobby in favor of a National Museum of Black History on the National Mall. I think that some of my colleagues on the right fear that an emphasis on our differences in the cultural arena is a slippery slope that will inevitably lead to different and ultimately unequal treatment in the legal arena. In order to preserve the notion of equal treatment under law and the anti-discrimination principle embodied in the 14th Amendment, some conservatives argue that we should never embrace multiculturalism in any form. This view seems to me to limit freedom in at least 4 ways. First, I think that it limits the freedom of individuals to celebrate their culture and history in the way they best see fit. Second, it limits the freedom of minority groups to honor members of their community and indeed to point to models of assimilation into the American mainstream, such as Judge Gonzalez. Third, in seeking to suppress the study of different racial and ethnic cultures, conservatives, I think, sometimes seek to limit educational and intellectual freedom. And fourth, as Professor Parker mentioned, this view limits the freedom to engage in democratic politics, which is necessarily a collection of identity or different interest group politics. On the other hand, there are those on the political left who encourage racial and ethnic minorities to value their subgroup affiliation over their national heritage. And this, I believe, is wrong. We see this very often in our educational system, in the failure to inculcate American values in our schools, and in the promotion of victim politics, to which Professor Wax alluded. The emphasis on subgroup identification over national identity also limits freedom in significant ways. First, an overemphasis on racial and ethnic identity does, as conservatives fear, undermine our national identity as Americans. When schools teach the history of Africa and ignore the history of the American Revolution and the American Civil Rights Movement, they are severing the ties that bind in the name of diversity. We also see this with bilingual education. When we sometimes force students of Hispanic heritage into educational programs designed to preserve culture and inculcate political values and preserve language to the detriment of having these students learn English, we also sever the ties that bind. Second, an overemphasis on racial or ethnic identity encourages segregation both in the workforce and elsewhere. Often, well-intentioned liberals seek to have Latinos and African Americans relegated to positions that require them to work primarily on minority issues. For example, a Hispanic reporter might be assigned to cover stories of interest to the Latino community instead of stories related to business and finance. Somehow this is seen as shoring up the individual's self-esteem and providing context to the reader in the form of a reporter from a particular interest group. Likewise, African American law professors are often expected to teach classes on civil rights rather than international law, and so on. And so this emphasis on racial and ethnic identity can create ethnic enclaves that are essentially segregated. Finally, an overemphasis on racial or ethnic identity promotes stereotypes and limits individual freedom of members in those racial and ethnic groups. When we encourage people to define themselves first and foremost by their racial and ethnic characteristics, we presume that members of these groups share common values. While this is, as a descriptive matter, often true, particularly in the cultural and social arena, the danger lies in the assumption that ethnic authenticity can and should, as a normative matter, be measured by a person's adherence to a particular political orthodoxy. The dangers of this approach are seen most publicly in the context of nominations to the judiciary and other high governmental posts. Take, for example, the treatment of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas or Attorney Miguel Estrada, one of President Bush's nominees to the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. As everybody in this room knows, Clarence Thomas has often been referred to as an Uncle Tom or a traitor to his race. Miguel Estrada, who immigrated to this country from Honduras as a young man, is an American success story of which all Americans should be proud. Yet because Estrada is a political conservative, there are those on the left who questions his ethnic loyalty, as they do of Justice Thomas. Some have even gone so far as to describe Estrada as, quote, Hispanic in name only, unquote. Make no mistake about it, the left's opposition to blacks and Latinos who dissent from the liberal orthodoxy is different in kind from the opposition to white conservatives. I have often heard, for example, people criticize Justice Thomas and virtually in the same breath praise his colleague and fellow conservative Antonin Scalia. As Professor Stephen Carter of the Yale Law School has written of the difference in treatment of white and black conservatives, quote, to be white and conservative is to be part of the American mainstream. To be black and conservative is to be part of the lunatic fringe. For many on the political left, then, identity has become a means of control. Only those Latinos or African Americans who genuflect to the liberal establishment are considered authentic. Those who cannot be controlled are considered self-haters or race traitors and are to be blocked from public service. In this sense, then, racial and ethnic identity, as defined by the political elite, has become not only freedom-limiting, but discriminatory. What does all of this mean for our legal and political discourse? First, I believe that it means our laws must remain colorblind. In order to avoid sowing resentment between the various racial and ethnic groups that make up America, our rules and our legal system must treat all Americans the same. This is necessary not only to preserve freedom, but to preserve the rule of law. But while our laws must be colorblind, our politics and social and educational discourse need not be. To the contrary, we can, and indeed should, celebrate our diversity and honor the contributions of various ethnic groups to American life. At the same time, however, we must reinforce the ties that bind by teaching and honoring American history, government, and the principles of participatory democracy. Striking the balance between multiculturalism and national unity is never easy. Arthur Schlesinger has put it this way: the question America confronts as a pluralistic society is how to vindicate cherished cultures and traditions without breaking the bonds of cohesion. I believe that preserving a neutral legal system and honoring our common culture, while at the same time encouraging all Americans to treasure our distinctive traditions, is the best way to preserve freedom for us all. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Take a minute for this to come up, and we'll have some fun with numbers. Okay, it's up on your screen. Now you have to get it up on mine, so I don't have to turn around all the time. I had, for some silly reason, thought that the talk was 15 minutes, and since it's 10 minutes, I had too much for 15 minutes. So I will be flipping by some slides quickly. My talk is, unlike the others, not highly normative, but it's descriptive, but about a lot of highly normative concepts. And I'm going to talk a bit about freedom and identity, which is actually the topic that we're supposed to talk about, and the. Let's see, it didn't come up here yet. One more try, and then I'll just turn around and talk. Oh well. Let's do that. Okay. There's some people seem to want to redistribute income and think that they should be giving it to people who have less money or may need it more. And one of the interesting questions is, what's the motivation for this kind of, is this motivated by generosity of spirit, or is this desire for a stronger leveling mainly a result of envy, as some free market economists have long asked? Now, I'll skip over some of the stuff on public opinion and what political scientists think about it. One of the fields I work in, which is social psychology, there's a thing called social dominance orientation, and there's even a scale, and it's made up of about approximately equal numbers of questions asking about desire for social dominance over others, to stomp on people's necks, essentially, and your desire to not to have, or your tolerance, essentially, for inequality of income. And so questions like, some of the social dominance questions, things like, inferior groups should stay in their place, superior groups should dominate inferior groups, and then questions like, we should strive to make incomes more equal. The idea here is that supposedly the desire for greater income redistribution is really a reflection of a desire for social dominance to stomp on people's necks. Now, this should strike people as odd, since usually you would think that people who were favored freedom in the economic sphere would also favor freedom in the social sphere, but that's not the assumption. And that's one of the things I want to present some data on today. The data for their position, their assumption that pro-capitalism and anti-redistribution tend to be associated with racism and a desire for dominance, and their evidence is basically they study their undergraduates, and they find this, and they use some very odd measures. Wow. There was a study that was done on political conservatism which got some press a year ago, which found that the two core dimensions of conservative thought were resistance to change and endorsement of inequality. And they report on studies and endorse the idea given in the last line there that pro-capitalist attitudes were associated with racism and social dominance orientation in the United States and Sweden among undergraduates. Von Mises on Marx, if you recall the classic book Socialism, published in 1922 but written a few years earlier, he says Marx preaches a doctrine of salvation which rationalizes their resentment and transfigures their envy and desire for revenge into a mission ordained by world history. Paul Johnson argues that Marx's anti-capitalism arose out of his hatred of Jews and constant problems with moneylenders. If you look at the earliest statements, his earliest statements of his hostility to capitalism, it comes out of the idea that money is the jealous god of Israel, and that talks about the money is the alien essence of man's work and existence, and the god of the Jews has been secularized and become the god of the world. So there's basically two different views. One is the standard view among academics that support for capitalism and opposition to income redistribution reflects racism and intolerance for minorities and desire for social dominance. And then the second view, reflected by von Mises and Paul Johnson's writings, which is that opposition to capitalism and support for income redistribution reflects envy, jealousy, negative feelings. Now, let's look at some data. I looked at, this is real studies with representative samples of the general public. 22,000 subjects, 17 general social surveys between 1978 and 2002. For traditional racism measures I used, do you think there should be laws against marriages between African Americans and whites? And then for a racial segregation one, white people have a right to keep African Americans out of their neighborhoods, and if they want to, and African Americans should respect that right. And on average, African Americans have worse jobs, money, income, and housing than white people. Do you think these differences are because most African Americans have less inborn ability? So the genetic explanation. And these have been used even by some of the social dominance orientation people in some of their scales. And then redistribution measures, they're basically the same version of the same question. Should, on the whole, do you think it should be the government's responsibility to reduce income differences between the rich and the poor? They correlate together. Turns out that redistributionists are more racist, slightly. This is on a scale, and the anti-redistributionists are at the top, and the racism scale goes off to the right. So the people who are pro-redistributionist are slightly more racist. Then there's some standard tests on intolerance. I won't go into how they're created, but basically they ask 15 questions. There's 5 different types of people: racists, homosexuals, communists, extreme militarists, and atheists. And should they be allowed to teach in college, speak in the subject community, or have their book removed from the library? So this is a basic freedom of speech kind of question. And it was developed by academics in the 50s, actually, to go at McCarthyism. It turns out that redistributionists are less tolerant, and this is a little starker. The anti-redistributionists are the most tolerant, and the pro-redistributionists the least tolerant, most intolerant. Then here's some measures of pro-capitalism and anti-capitalism. Price control, everyone should have a job. Should the government control prices and profits for the steel industry? And it turns out that this is even more dramatic. Pro-capitalists are the least racist at the top, anti-capitalists the most racist. On tolerance, again, quite dramatic. And the correlation here on this one is 0.3. The correlation between a 7-point scale rating from extremely liberal to extremely conservative and strong Democrat to strong Republican, the correlation there is only 0.27. So this is a stronger correlation than something that we accept every day as being a very important relationship, and yet it's directly contrary to that hypothesis. It actually parallels with some other findings in the post-Soviet culture in Russia. The Russian authoritarianism tended to be correlated with support for communist principles of distributive justice and egalitarianism, anti-capitalist and anti-democratic attitudes, and ethnocentrism. We find the same thing in the United States. There's a question in the General Social Survey about blindly obeying the law even when it violates your own conscience. And people who tend to agree with that also tend to support income redistribution, anti-capitalism, and traditional racism. It's related to education, you're not surprised, related to income. Those who are higher income tend to be more open to capitalism. There's some regression analysis I don't have time to talk about. What about the emotional makeup of a redistributionist? I'm just getting into that, but it turns out that redistributionists and anti-capitalists tend to report that they were angry more often in a typical week, and that the intensity of their anger was more serious. Further, when asked about the last time they were angry, strong redistributionists were about 3 times more likely to admit that they responded to their anger by plotting revenge. You know, how could they be so far wrong? They basically used bad samples, bad measures. Now, since the topic was sort of looking at identity politics and freedom, I thought I'd pull out some of the different kinds of freedom variables, because not every one of those is directly related to preference for freedom. So I picked the one for freedom to marry whomever you want. That seems to be pretty personal. One for the tolerance, which is sort of the freedom of speech idea, the tolerance scale, and then setting government control of prices and wages. And I looked at race, gender, religion, and party identification. And the only group that significantly had higher preference for all those types of freedom of the groups I looked at were Jewish respondents, and they scored higher in favoring all those 3 different types. There's four measures there, but all 3 different types. The only group that significantly disfavored all 3 different types were Democrats. Now, this is a Federalist talk, and those who sort of stereotype Federalist talks would think I should end there. But realistically, the Federalist talks are actually interested in getting to the bottom of it. And that just masks what's really going on, and I want to show you what's really going on. It turns out that what you need to do, and this is what I'm finding is a crucial part of what I'm working on my PhD thesis, a crucial part of the argument making PhD thesis, is you've got to break down by both party and political orientation. Because it turns out there's 2 very different kinds of Democrats. There's conservative and moderate Democrats, and they are the sort of what the people consider to be conservatives, conservative Republicans. That's the stereotype they have of conservative Republicans, the Archie Bunker types. They tend to be less well-educated, more racist, more intolerant. And they're very different than liberal Democrats. So that conservative and moderate Democrats, and this is tolerance, they are the most intolerant. And then you see at the bottom, the least intolerant, that is the most tolerant, are liberal independents and liberal Democrats. And so you see that you've got Democrats at the top of the scale and almost at the bottom of the scale. You see conservative Republicans are slightly, not significantly, but slightly more tolerant than average. They're kind of in the middle, but close to liberal Democrats. They're basically just 2 places away. And because both liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans are highly educated, in fact, on a large number of issues that people associate with conservatives, they tend to be very close, liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans. Now here's the ones for racial intermarriage. Again, conservative and moderate Democrats are the most racist on this measure. And at the bottom, again, liberal independents, liberal Democrats. Conservative Republicans in 4th place, slightly more tolerant, less racist than average, though not significantly so for them. It's virtually the same chart. There's only two adjacent places that switched. And then here's in the economic sphere, and here you find conservative Republicans are much stronger advocates of freedom than anyone else, and at the least strong advocates of freedom. That is, the people most in favor of wage controls are liberal Democrats, moderate Democrats, and conservative Democrats. So in the economic sphere, you can generalize about Democrats not being in favor of freedom, but in the personal and in the freedom of speech sphere, it turns out that liberal Democrats are in fact highly favoring of freedom, and in fact more so than conservative Republicans. So the pattern here is really more complex. There are two very different kinds of Democrats, and to lump them together really conflates what is, I think, a quite interesting pattern. Thank you.
Education as an explanatory variable here?
You mean for the last one? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't do it.
Good morning.
But of course that doesn't.
When I accepted this assignment, I didn't realize that talking about identity at Harvard was a uncommonly perilous activity, but I'm happy to be here anyways. I noted that Jennifer Braceras indicated a number of things, that identity ought to be off limits in terms of law, but that it ought to be celebrated in terms of politics and culture, and pointed out, in fact, that how much pride there was in the recent confirmation of of Judge Gonzalez to be Attorney General. And certainly one can reflect that the same was felt and manifested when Antonin Scalia was named to the court among Italian Americans. I assume that same support will be there when he's elevated to the chief's position. And I'm just waiting for an outbreak of Polish American support for a nominee to the court. Now, many wise things have already been said this morning, some of them somewhat in tension, but that I think there is at least one common theme, and that is that for each member of the panel, use of identity has hazards associated with it, that it is not just a simple matter. Even Professor Parker, who I indicated much support in places for identity, indicated that minority identification and self-identification is problematic, that it tends to be an artificial limitation on freedom, and with this I tend to agree. But I also think it needs a very important corollary or qualification, and there's probably two ways to express this corollary or qualification. Since we're at Harvard, the most appropriate way is to express it in classical Latin, libertas non datur sine veritate, which you're all translating to mean there is no liberty without truth. The other way is to bring it out in the context of a popular Burl Ives song that I used to sing with my children, and that is, as you go through life, make this your goal, watch the donut, not the hole. Those of you who were here last evening realize how profound Burl Ives is on that matter, because Michael Sandel instructed us, I think correctly, that to define liberty, one must know what you're defining it against. Liberty defined in relation to a particular social activity. Professor Sandel suggested that this was an instrumental thing that was necessary for judges to make decisions, so that Justice Scalia was, he suggested, somewhat wrong in indicating that understanding the significance of golf was unimportant in terms of assessing Casey Martin's liberty claim. I tend to think that golf is not that important, but I do agree that Professor Sandel is right, that you do need to know against what social activity liberty is claimed. But the important corollary of liberty, that there is no liberty without truth, also means that one must assess the significance of the activity in relation to the truth of the human person, the identity of the true identity of the human person. And we hinted a little bit at this last night, but we weren't quite willing to bite on it. But since I'm not worried about confirmability, I will bite on it for a little bit. Now, what is the truth of the human person? Now, of course, millennia of work has been spent on this, from Thales to Socrates to Plato to Aristotle on forward, and I won't repeat that in the remaining minutes. But I will say that there is, in fact, something unique about the American experiment, and that it comes with a definition. It comes with a definition that, in fact, the human being has an identity. And that definition is in the Declaration of Independence. And that identity is one that is identified that we are created, that as created beings we pre-exist the state, and therefore are not subject to the state's willful redefinition, and that part of our created pre-existing identity is that we come with inalienable rights. And inalienable rights are exactly what they sound like, that not even the possessor of them can justify encroaching upon them. They are a direct consequence of our created identity. And while, of course, our created identity can be violated, it can never be legitimately displaced or obscured by government. And in this, it should be contrasted with civil liberties or civil rights, which are not the product of our created identity, but are, in fact, the product of our conventional or political or policy choices. And those, too, can be validated or violated, but they can, on occasion, also be legitimately withdrawn. Now, how do we know that this is the truth of our identity? The founders speculated on this, and they gave you some answers. They gave you answers from philosophy, the law of nature. They gave you answers from faith, the law of nature's God. And then they gave you an answer in positive law. As a matter of philosophy, they spent a good deal of time with people you're familiar with, such as Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and Montaigne and others. Locke, for example, said, "For a man not having the power of his own life," man does not own himself, "cannot by compact of his own consent enslave himself to others, and therefore he cannot give that power which he doesn't have in himself to others either." That's a pretty intriguing philosophical concept, and one that is in a good deal of tension with absolute claims of autonomy. Faith we'll talk about in a minute, but let's not forget that the Declaration of Independence and these ruminations at the time of the founding are part of our original understanding. And insofar as the Declaration is part of the organic law as it is, one can't, I would suggest, understand the nature of the Constitution and its design without some reference back to the human identity in the Declaration. Abraham Lincoln once reflected on the proverb that a word fitly spoken is like an apple of gold in a frame of silver. And Lincoln reminded us that the apple of gold was the Declaration and the Constitution was the frame, and that the Constitution, the frame, was made for the apple, not the other way around. And you can see the genius of the Constitution in its separated powers, in its enumerated powers, and it's an extremely important guarantee of religious freedom only in these lights. All three, the separation of powers, federalism, and religious freedom, reflect something additional about the human capacity, and that is the incompleteness and imperfectibility of who we are as human beings. Yes, the founders said there's truth about us, the truth exists, some of it can even be declared to be self-evident, but it will only be at any given time and any given moment in our political history partially grasped. And therefore you need separated powers to help you avoid that incomplete understanding of who you are from falling into tyranny or oppression or avarice. One needs enumerated power, including the division of power between the state and federal government, to reflect that the sum and substance of who we are is not just governmental activity. The sum and substance of the donut is, in fact, much of society that is outside of governmental activity. And it occurs, as I think Professor Wax's remarks beginning here this morning reminded us, it occurs in schools and families and workplaces and in churches. And of course, part of our assumed self-evident truth is that we are created by God, but since no person has a superior empirical proof of God, we have guaranteed unfettered freedom to explore that issue for ourselves. Now let's get down to cases in the last minute or so remaining. What practical lessons does this identification, this definition of human identity give us? I'm going to suggest a few. Human identity is obscured, not clarified, when the Supreme Court excludes religion from the public square and dictates a secular state by imposing an uncalled-for neutrality between religion and no religion. We are free to be atheists, but the created identity that we identified in our founding documents as a corporate matter is not. Next Tuesday, the Supreme Court ought to rid itself of Everson and the Lemon v. Kurtzman errors and recognize that the public display of teachings that inform the founding is no improper establishment or coercion under law. Point number 2. Human identity is obscured, not clarified, when the federal government seeks to enforce federal drug laws in a way that obliterates the distinction between what is national and what is local. Now, I think recreational drug use is self-destructive, and I also think that drug crime facilitates everything from mob to gang violence to terrorism. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that a woman with a brain tumor using marijuana under a doctor's supervision is not engaged in interstate commercial activity. The failure of the United States in its briefing and argument to know the difference is distressing, and it is deeply threatening, let me suggest, to Mrs. Raich's identity, her very existence. Now, human identity is also obscured, I think, and not clarified when race is made the basis of public decision. Grutter, I think, is the proof of this. Grutter suggested that it was not relying upon race as a stereotype. It proclaimed that. But then a sentence later, it relied on race as a stereotype. Many other examples in gerrymandering and other places can be given, but since the stop sign is also being given, let me end this way. And let me end with the question that was given to this panel. Is identity as a created human being the starting point or the ending point? I think we have to admit that in much of our history it has been the ending point. Tawney's identification of Dred Scott as a part of a group considered in his judgment a subordinate and inferior class of beings who have been subjugated by a superior race is probably Exhibit A. But at least for some in this room, Justice Blackmun's identification of the unborn as a constitutional non-person is not far behind. Now, in 2005, it is self-evident to us that slavery is not consistent with the defined human identity specified in the Declaration of Independence, Roger Taney notwithstanding. There is no consensus on this point, I would suggest, with regard to abortion. So then, how are such competing claims of identity and freedom to be resolved? One answer is to say that when a claim of freedom is in disregard of created human identity, it is specious and should be judicially disavowed. That's a difficult answer. The answer cannot, however, be dismissed out of hand without sacrificing all fidelity to the founding aspect of some self-evident truth. After all, how many of us can comfortably read Tawney's Dred Scott decision today to the effect that it is not the province of the court to decide upon the justice or injustice of slavery without somewhere in our human capacity at cringing? But of course, a very large part of the human identity is, as I mentioned before, not fully grasping the truth of even our own natures, and that is why such sensitive issues as abortion and marriage are contested today. There is a truth of identity in each case, And the Court is, it seems to me, frightfully wrong when it says that human beings define their own place and their own existence in the universe. But if the truth is contested, democracy suggests that any provisional answer must be given by the people in legislative assembly. We, the people, may very well get it wrong, but at least then the conversation won't be stopped dead in its constitutional tracks by a judicial imposition of a view, especially one that creates, or rather destroys, the created human identity and puts us at war with ourselves. After all, we did not say we hold these random thoughts that however we got here, we have the right to be left alone. Thank you very much.
We're going to give our speakers each a couple of minutes to in the same order, to comment on what the other speakers have said, and then turn our time over to the audience for questions that you may want to raise. To get the crosstalk going, I just want to observe that I think it's characteristic of Americans to be so concerned with getting this question of identity right, because it's something we've done so well when you compare our track record with that of anyone else. We obviously have highly difficult tasks yet remaining, but there is no other country that has assimilated cultures and created a new man in the same way that the United States has. And think of the recent problems in France, which is, of course, dedicated to a secular culture and a French identity without subdivisions, has been unable to deal peaceably with its large Islamic community and has dealt with this headdress issue in a way that would never happen here. I'm confident of that. When Arabs come to the United States and become Arab Americans, instead of getting into a problem of that sort with the state, they elect Spencer Abraham to the Senate. It's a very different outcome. Amy Wax?
Yes, I just wanted to readdress the question of perhaps the positive uses of identity, as Commissioner Braceras and Professor Parker pointed out. I was perhaps unduly negative. I do agree that there are many positive uses of identity and that it is valuable to maintain one's group identity or a sense of one's group identity, and wholly apart from that, I think it's of the essence of human freedom that we at least have the choice to do that. But I am concerned that this choice to identify with subgroups not become dysfunctional or crippling or an impediment. And I think the challenge here is largely, although not exclusively, psychological. The question of how we can internally reconcile our identity, which may, for some subgroups, often involve a history of mistreatment, persecution, oppression, that we may not want to push aside or forget. I myself was raised in a very devout Jewish home, and one of the watchwords was never forget. How can we remember without becoming embittered and limited by our remembrance? That was a very large challenge of my upbringing. So I wanted to sort of share an observation with you. Someone once asked me, how can one recognize persecution and oppression, right, and still move forward and grasp opportunities? Is it possible to do that? I think one way I saw it done in my upbringing was that even though my parents, my relatives, my very close circle of family and friends within the Jewish community, the modern Orthodox Jewish community, were constantly talking about past persecution, oppression, discrimination ad nauseum. I never ever heard a single individual explain their own failings or failures, or successes for that matter, as caused by or an outgrowth of discrimination or persecution. I mean, this was sort of an abstraction about our history as a people, but it never was brought to ground in the way that individuals thought about their own destiny, their own existence, and their own choices. So I think in a way there does need to be this kind of disconnect. As individuals, we see ourselves as free to make good or bad choices under the constraints that an opportunity society does create for us, and that is not necessarily antithetical to recognizing and remembering the history that brought us here.
Richard.
I have a brief comment or maybe question about James Lindgren's last slide and what it seems to suggest about the identity politics of highly educated progressives. That last slide indicated that in terms of intolerance and racism, liberal independents and liberal Democrats were scored best, as it were. I wonder if you tested them not with respect to intolerance and racism, but with respect to A, a sense of their own superiority, and B, a tendency to suppress the views of others. I wonder if they wouldn't score worst. It's been my experience. My experience suggests they might well score worst. And frankly, that's one thing I've always liked about the Federalist Society, and that is that highly educated conservatives don't seem to share those defects.
Jim, do you want to respond to that? I'll do it. Okay. All right. Jonathan?
Well, I think that sort of dovetails with my theme, which is that the pressure for, or part of my theme, which is that the pressure for conservative minorities, or minorities in general, to conform to a certain liberal orthodoxy is great, and it's I think bred by both what Professor Parker calls the superiority, feelings of superiority by people on the left, as well as intolerance, but they seem to have a certain view of what minorities should think, and there is great pressure to conform to that. So yeah, I think that some of the statistics and the numbers bear that out.
Okay, I had a comment first about Amy's that really, it seems to me that part of your argument can be raise something I call the Freudian fallacy, which is the idea of psychoanalysis is you figure out why you're screwed up, and then all of a sudden you're not screwed up. And of course, that doesn't necessarily follow. You might really figure out why you're screwed up, and still you need a more behaviorist approach to solving it. And I recall my brother, who's a clinical child psychologist on the University of Iowa faculty, trained here at Harvard in the late 70s in a psych fellowship, and he had a child who was, I think, as I recall, 8 to 9 years old. He was having problems. He'd come in for therapy. He was adopted. He was African American with white parents. He was mildly learning disabled. He was having problems at school. And one of his adopted parents was having a sex change operation. And when he went to discuss the case with the psychiatrist who was supervising him, the psychiatrist said, you've really got to probe into what events in his early childhood were causing him problems today. And, it wasn't that, having a sex change operation necessarily meant you were going to have problems, but when you do have the constellation of things going on, there were plenty of things to deal with just at the level of coming up with rules and therapies and behaviorist approaches. And it seems to me that that's part of what you're getting at. As far as the issue that Richard Parker just raised about tolerance, I certainly see a lot of what you see, and I certainly want to look and see whether there's a trend in it. In fact, I was just trying to run a few numbers right after you said it to try to figure out if I could see if there had been a trend toward more intolerance. I think it's partly when you have institutions which I notice it when the Federalist Society is demonized in schools. It tends to be where there's no conservative faculty or very few, and I think that ignorance breeds prejudice, and this has been known for a long time. And I think if people are ignorant about conservatives and libertarians, they tend to be highly prejudiced about them. And so I think we happen to be in an area where this is very common. But of course, we see a lot of this in the press as well. So it's not just academics. So I'd agree with that. And then Jennifer talked about differences, talking about immigrants and what makes someone American. I've actually been poking around a bit to try and proposing to do a paper on differences in viewpoint between people, all of whose grandparents were born in the United States, full third-generation Americans, and immigrants, and see what the differences in views are. And I've just started looking at some of the things, and I'm trying to remember exactly some of them were. They asked, what's the most important thing for a child, and list various things. And immigrants were more likely to say children should work hard. And third-generation Americans were more likely to say that children should learn to think independently. Immigrants were less likely to watch television, less likely to go to bars, more likely to think that women's place was in the home. And when asked a series of questions about why African Americans did poorly, including the genetic question I had up here, as well as poor schools, discrimination, whatever, third-generation Americans would say no to all of them. They learned, no, you just get in trouble by trying to give up with something that I guess Larry Summers just learned, that one can get in trouble for speculating about the reason for performance or differences in status. And then the last thing is that to become fully American, you have to become suspicious of immigrants, and that's the last move to be fully assimilated. Now, we're talking about small differences here, obviously, but that's the trend I saw. And there are a lot of black conservatives, not just not in the public sphere. If you asked in the general public, then whether you're conservative, blacks are almost as likely as other groups to say that they're conservative.
They're just criticized when they come out of the closet, that's all.
Yeah.
Doug Kamick.
As you know, the thrust of my presentation was to suggest that definitionally there was a human identity that transcends many of the subparts that we've been talking about. That there is a definition that forms that common bond that to some degree supersedes and makes the republic work in ways that focusing on race or ethnicity or sex or other forms of sub-identity do not. What I heard from Jennifer in part and Richard in part was that, and Amy just in her response just recently, is that it's quite appropriate within the context of culture to keep alive the celebration and the story of one's roots. And it seems to me that that is a very healthy thing to do. Jennifer and Richard also posited, however, that it was appropriate, at least in some places, for politics and maybe even law, I'm unclear about that in terms of their presentation, not so much in Jennifer's, but I'm unclear of it in Richard's, whether there's a place in law for this identification as well. If there is, I'm troubled by it and think we ought to discuss it, because last night my former colleague and always friend Charles Fried pointed out nicely that virtue is useless unless it is freely chosen, and I think that's very true. But I also think that there's something that we have to recognize in the profession that we're in, and that the law is a teacher. And that insofar as the law embraces these sub-identities and makes them an organizing principle in the construction of political or legislative districts or in the allocation of public resources, that to that extent they undermine the ultimate pursuit of the understanding of the definition of human identity that got the Republic off the ground.
Take questions from the audience. We'll ask you to come to one of the two microphones. Just state your name and affiliation, and please try to keep the questions relatively brief. And questions, not statements.
Thank you. This question is for Commissioner Braceras. I'm an unreconstructed individualist, so I'd wonder how you respond to this argument that group identities are more often than not imposed on us externally by the culture of multiculturalism, and that they're based on physical characteristics and the arbitrary circumstances of where one's ancestors came from, and that this really abridges free will and self-determination, and that this is really an infringement on individual liberties.
I think that sometimes that can be true, and that in those circumstances it's bad. But I mean, in my own case, I feel that my ethnic identity or my identity as a human being came mostly from my parents, which you can say that it was imposed by them. But you know, I feel you know, my identity as a human being, as an American, as somebody who's part Puerto Rican, somebody who's part Jewish, those are all things that I feel, you know, were inculcated in the home by my family, so in a positive way, not in a negative way. You know, other aspects of my identity as a Federalist, as a conservative, were freely chosen by me, although you can argue that those came, you know, from values that were in the home as well. So maybe one's political values aren't fully freely chosen either. You always have influences, be it teachers or parents or what have you, that shape your worldview. So to some extent, our identity is always going to be imposed from someone from the outside. But if we're happy, you know, with our own identity, then I think that's fine. As long, you know, I don't think anybody should tell us what to think because we're a member of a certain group. But we're free to identify ourselves how we wish.
Gary Lawson, Boston University School of Law. And I'd like to ask Professor Parker, in light of the fascinating theoretical structure that he gave us, what is to be done? And specifically, what is to be done in a world in which the state is less a vehicle for democratic self-expression than for organized looting? Specifically, we wouldn't call it a pathology if, when you put a lion next to the lamb, we also probably want Jim Lindgren to select a nice Bordeaux to go with the menu. Are the features of identity politics that you call pathologies properly called pathologies, or are they instead the natural order of things in a world in which wealth is up for grabs? How do you get from here to your there?
Well, if I follow you, I am coming from a different starting point than most of the speakers, I think, in that I don't fear politics, therefore I don't fear the state. Quite to the contrary, I see politics as the realm of freedom by which we can struggle with one another to take control of the state. There's a tinge of despair, perhaps I'm misreading it in your statement, I'm not misreading it, that I just don't share, and I would just say this, on behalf of your own sense of freedom, I think you should move beyond that despair.
Fair enough.
Some of us find that despair quite charming, and as you were speaking, I was just thinking about how much I miss you since you've gone to BU from Northwestern. So.
My name is Joel Bennick. I'm from Temple University School of Law, and my question is for Professor Lundgren. In the rebuttal period, you talked about the difference in responses from recent immigrants and third-generation Americans, and I was wondering what you thought constituted the reasons for those differences, what has occurred in the generational residents in the country that led to different answers than those who had recently immigrated?
Well, one of the things, I haven't really explored that yet, but I'm planning on looking at, I mean, I think it's the socialization of the culture, so it means education and family and TV and those kinds of things. But one of the things I want to look at is does it matter whether your mother was born in another country or your father, to try to figure out who transmits who's more important for the socialization. And I also want to look at, there's some pretty good data from other parts of the world, mostly Europe. I also want to look at what characterizes American differences from other parts of the world, because I think immigrants, because they came here, are actually different than people in their home country in significant respects. So I wish I had the answer, but I don't yet.
That's really interesting, that research.
Joe Brennan, University of Michigan. First off, I'd like to thank all the panelists and Judge Ginsburg. Professor Lindgren, this question is for you, though I'd be interested in hearing all the panelists respond. I have some very good friends who consider themselves progressives, and every time I go over to their house and knock on their door, I see a sticker that they've put on their front door which says, "Intolerance will not be tolerated," which always makes me chuckle because it's logically not consistent, but I think it encapsulates the idea that they have that some ideas are just beyond, are no longer debatable. Slavery, for example, it's just not debatable. And I think oftentimes in the progressive community, there's a larger set of ideas that they would consider beyond debate, for example, same-sex marriage. And in the larger community, or in the conservative community, these ideas are still considered to be debatable. So what do you see that accounts for that gap between sort of the progressive view and sort of the conservative or larger view?
Well, one of the things that, I'm not going to, I don't know the answer to that one, but one of the things that's raised by your question is that it should be striking to people sitting in university and law schools, but isn't, which is there is a lot more diversity of viewpoint in the Federalist Society than there is in any other organization, including the ones that are not explicitly political. If you look at I've been developing a new conservatism index based on asking specific questions rather than just self-identification, and I gave it to a couple of Federalist Society talks, and it still needs a lot of work, but it was interesting to look at where people spread. I gave it at a Midwest Law and Economics Association meeting, which wasn't Federalist Society. There was one person who was a strong conservative out of the 30 people there. There were a bunch of people in the middle, and then there were a bunch of people on the left. And I gave it at a Federalist Society event, and the students in the audience were at the 25th percentile. In other words, they were 25% of the questions they gave a liberal answer to. The Federalist Society panelists, who were professors who were members of the Federalist Society, they were at the 40th. They gave 40% of the time gave a liberal answer. The liberal commentators were at the 98th percentile on the liberalism index. If you took 17 issues and you saw how the New York Times lined up on those issues, or the people on the Judiciary Committee like Schumer and whatever, they're going to be right down the line with one or two exceptions, maybe drug use or something like that. They're going to be right down the line. And you just see within the Federalist Society, there's a lot of people who favor abortion. There's a lot of people who, as I favor, a lot of people who oppose abortion. You can find a lot of people who favor affirmative action, a lot of people who oppose affirmative action. You can find much closer, much more diversity in this group than you do in any other political organization in law schools.
Jim, when you remarked earlier on homogeneous law faculties being ignorant about and hostile to the Federalist Society, it strikes me as another manifestation, in a way, of what Cass Sunstein has been working on, his published work dealing with heterogeneity of viewpoints on judicial panels, and his ongoing project dealing with the effect of heterogeneity on jury awards. It has a moderating influence in both contexts in terms of what his research shows.
You mentioned how certain things are considered no longer debatable in polite society, and how, particularly in so-called progressive communities, there are certain issues that are just off the table and non-negotiable and not debatable. But the majority of those issues are all tend to be race and gender issues. In other words, most liberals, even if they believe in, at least in my experience, most liberals, even if they believe in redistribution of wealth and those types of things, will admit that those concepts are debatable, and they will engage willingly in discussions with conservatives about issues like taxes or Social Security reform or other issues. As soon as you bring up affirmative action, abortion, any of the race and gender issues, the debate often shuts down, because those are the issues that are considered off the table, which it's bizarre, I think, that the identity issues are the ones that are off the table, because identity is such a personal concept that it seems to me there would be a greater variety of views as opposed to a smaller one.
I'd like to ask, one of your examples when you gave your revulsion at seeing the sticker, or disagreement with seeing the sticker.
It just makes me chuckle, that's all.
Yeah. I would chuckle in the same way, because the subtext would be, that intolerance will not be tolerated really means conservative thought or conservative political positions or traditional positions will not be tolerated, is really what the bumper sticker is saying. And I think Jennifer picked up on that subtext as well, which is what makes it a sticker not worth accepting. But your proposition that meant that slavery was not therefore debatable. In fact, I think slavery is not debatable for all of the reasons I stated in the talk and for a great many more, and I think you would probably agree. So that at some level we do agree that intolerance or that level of denial of basic identity will not be tolerated. There are enormous areas where we disagree, and I think Jennifer's fine point is that on the issues of abortion and affirmative action and marriage and all these other sensitive topics, we can't stop the discussion, and we can't use illegitimate means through the courts or otherwise to stop that discussion. So you need a bumper sticker. It's going to be a little longer than that one to say, intolerance will not be tolerated, but, and then proceed thereafter.
Exceptions, of course. Thank you.
Sir.
Hi, my name is Igor Dubinsky. I'm from DePaul University College of Law. My question is for Professor Wax and Commissioner Braceras. Referring to the analogy that you made earlier with the paraplegic, I think the closer analogy is that the great-great-grandkids of the drunk driver are now asked to support no longer the paraplegic great-great-grandkids, but maybe the tired or the obese, some other kind of affliction. And I was wondering, as a definition of identity, where do you see the government's role as a moral role to step in and say, well, now these people had nothing to do with this condition or with this kind of definition of identity? Where does the government step in and say, well, we should be the ones that are controlling? And also, where does the government draw its power from to do that?
Right. I think that it is highly, it is contestable whether the current condition of the great-great-grandkids of the guy who got run over, right, is somehow causally related to that old insult. And I think there is certainly one view that their disadvantage is a kind of causal legacy of that. So people really do disagree about that. One of the things I'm trying to do in this project is just sidestep that whole fruitless debate of, who's responsible for what led to our present dilemma. Because one could tell a story, that the past insult has, in some sense, produced the current problem. I think one of the oppositions, or one of the bases for opposition to affirmative action, reparations, all of these compensatory measures, is just to deny that link, to say that it's been dissipated or attenuated along the lines of sort of approximate cause type of analysis. But that is just such a Gordian knot. I'd really rather not try and disentangle it. I'd rather just cut it and say, who cares, right? Whether or not it's so, the solution, because of the very nature of the problem, is simply not going to lie with outsiders producing the result that we all seek, which is for previously disadvantaged people to take their rightful place under their own steam as citizens and productive members of society. And also, I should add that I'm not denying that there is no present discrimination, because I think discrimination continues. What I am denying is that discrimination is now the sort of major factor or even a very important factor in some of the group disadvantages that we see. It is out there, but I think other factors have come to the fore.
Just to speak to sort of your larger question about what role the government should have in defining identity, I think the answer is none. I have no problem with either. There's been a debate recently about whether the government should even collect data on racial and ethnic identity and even be able to ask those sorts of questions. I have no problem with the data collection, particularly since I think it serves an educational and social science objective. I would prefer to see questions on government surveys and documents be more open-ended and let people define themselves. Because I think, as Professor Parker mentioned in his remarks, these categories are neither limited nor static. And when you just ask people to check a box, are they Hispanic, African American, Asian, whatever, I think that it's too blunt a characterization, especially for several reasons. I mean, we live in a country where people intermarry constantly, and I mean, my children, for example, are, a quarter Argentinian, a quarter Puerto Rican, a quarter Jewish, a quarter Scottish. What box do they check? So, you could say, well, they're 50% Hispanic, so they can probably maybe more comfortably check that box than any other, but allowing people to fill it in themselves, however they perceive themselves, I think is the best way to do that. And also psychologically, I think even people in the exact same family can perceive themselves differently and identify differently. I mean, I take my husband's family where there are 5 children and their father was from Argentina and their mother was Scottish American. Of the 5 children, 2 of them would identify themselves as Hispanic and the other 3 would not. And part of that, I think, comes from the fact that some of them were born in the United States and some of them weren't. And some of them, the ones that weren't born in the United States, including my husband, has just always had more of an interest in Argentine politics, Latin American politics and culture, and made it his business to study Spanish and keep in touch with the relatives down there and those kind of things. But he has another brother who, on census documents doesn't check the Hispanic box at all. So it's a very personal thing, and I don't think the government should have any role in imposing it.
Could I just recommend a book on this point? It's called The Minority Rights Revolution by John Screntney. It traces in detail the history between 1965 and 75 of the federal government's official definition of minorities. And one of the surprising things is how little debate, almost no debate, there was at the time about how to identify them.
Can I just raise, earlier this week, the court decided Johnson versus California, the California prison case involving the segregation of prisoners by race during the first 60 days of their incarceration to prevent them from killing each other. The Supreme Court, as you know, decided, consistently with Jennifer's direction, that race should be no factor in the allocation of cell space as these people are transferred around or are being introduced into the prison system. It's interesting to note that, while I think that's in all likelihood the right result, one couldn't help but be be concerned as one read Justice Thomas's very thoughtful dissent that said, well, we've now preserved the dignity of these individuals at the cost of their lives. And some very difficult questions then start to get asked as second-order questions. The first difficult question that was asked by the Los Angeles County jail system, which doesn't segregate on the basis of race, it segregates on the basis of gang. But of course, every gang in Los Angeles is organized around the principles of race, and everybody knows that. So while I think the general answer is the one that Jennifer gave, I think there are contingent facts, as Richard Parker suggested before, that can give a different answer when you look at close problems up closely.
Last question.
Thank you. Try to keep it short. Given particularly what Ms. Viceres brought out about the importance of having a larger national identity for people to identify with as they celebrate their individual identities, I don't know if you would consider this legitimate, but it occurs to me that there are times when the construction of that larger identity, times maybe in our history, has been, although facially neutral, actually constructed in such a way as to exclude the effective participation. For example, I think of women in the academy maybe a few generations back where the definition of rationality may have been facially neutral but actually intended to sort of exclude women's contribution. You may not accept that at all, but is there a potential in the constructing of large identities for certain identities to be excluded or marginalized, and how do we address that if it's just a human issue, a human fallibility issue?
First of all, the construction of a larger American identity doesn't necessarily mean that that identity or aspects of our history or government can't be criticized. So I think it's very basic concept, really, that I think that what's lacking in so many of our schools today is any teaching of principles of freedom and participatory democracy, what it means to live in a democracy, major historical events that occurred in our country, and you can talk about that in an inclusive way. That doesn't mean that always happens, but I live in Concord, Massachusetts, which is the birthplace of the American Revolution, and believe it or not, they don't teach any American history in that school other than the oppression of Native Americans and slavery until middle school. How can they not discuss the American Revolution in Concord, Massachusetts? It's appalling to me. And I've had an ongoing debate with the people who run the social studies curriculum there, because my children, you know, they have the days off for President's Day and Martin Luther King Day and Veterans Day. They have no idea why. They have no idea why. So I don't think that the creation or the teaching of a larger national American identity has to be from any particular political perspective. It's just teaching basic principles. I mean, Election Day was another example. This is an election year. It would have been a great opportunity in the public schools to talk to the kids about democracy and voting, and you know, no need to endorse a particular candidate in the classroom. No, silence in the Concord Public Schools as to what was going on. And when I asked why they weren't using this opportunity to talk to the kids about democracy, they said, well, we don't want to politicize things. So there's this sense that you can't talk about anything these days in the public schools other than the history of particular grievance groups, that if you talk about anything larger, you're going to cause offense. And, I mean, that just astounds me. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say, I think the history of democracy, it's a work in progress, has been the history of greater inclusiveness and of modification of, you know, who is properly a part of it. But I guess having three kids myself who are school age, I would say that in order to talk about the 19th Amendment, it's nice if you can talk about the first 18 first and have some sense of what they are. And that's what's lacking. I mean, we have kids who can't give an approximate date for the Revolutionary War, think that possibly the Civil War might have come before it or maybe after it. I mean, we're talking about the fundamentals, so, you know, I don't see thinking about how we erred by excluding women is antithetical to learning something about the history of our country.
I just had a brief comment, and it wasn't in response to this question, but an earlier question. I just ran some numbers to get numbers on the number of African American conservatives, and in the 2002 General Social Survey, 33% of African Americans identified as conservatives. In the 2000, it was 21%, so that's a high variability, and probably it's somewhere in between the two. 26% of Hispanics said they were conservatives, and 36% of whites. So the number of African Americans and Hispanics is not all that different who identify themselves as conservatives, and yet in the public sphere, we don't know that. That's not something that's widely known.
Well, I can't tell you how many times during the course of this morning's proceedings I was reminded of the story of two elderly Jewish men sitting on a park bench in New York reading the newspaper, and one of them one day says, I see that the Pope has exonerated the Jews in the death of Christ. And the other one says, well, who do you think did it? and the answer comes, the Puerto Ricans. We'll take a 15-minute coffee break and come back. Please join me in thanking our panel. That was great. I'm so sorry I wouldn't know.
By the Willard School.
Our older kids started the conference
Oh, really?
They can't be as bad.
I'm sure there were.
Oh, I don't think so. You know that internal courtyard? Your kids are little.
Yeah.
Go to the high school. When our kids were there, they would let people sit where it was actually.
They might not do that anymore, but
No, leave it on
the teaching is equally bad. Oh, right.
Excellent, Doug. Excellent. Excellent.
We got the labor movement. We only get Native Americans.